Listen, can you hear it? That sound like the earth itself splitting open. That is not your imagination. That is the sound of Lake Ladoga in December 1939, when the temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. When you breathe air that cold, it crystallizes in your lungs. When you bleed on snow that cold, the white turns pink before your heart stops beating. And when you die in cold like that, you don't decay. You don't rot. You freeze into a statue, your final expression of terror preserved forever, locked in ice like an insect in amber. In the Winter War, the cold didn't just kill you, it preserved your terror forever. Welcome back to Ghost Stories of the Battles. I am your host, and tonight, we are trading the trenches of the Western Front for the frozen hellscape of the Karelian Isthmus. We're going to a place where hell didn't freeze over. It was built from ice to begin with. The 30th of November, 1939, the Soviet Union, emboldened by the Molotov, Ribbentrop-pact and hungry for territorial expansion, launched a massive invasion of Finland. On paper, it was no contest. The Red Army brought nearly 500,000 men, thousands of tanks, and the full weight of Stalin's military machine. Finland had 180,000 soldiers, outdated equipment, and the kind of grim determination that only comes from defending your home against impossible odds. The Battle of Taipale was the meat grinder where this desperation crystallized into legend. Located on the Karelian Isthmus between Lake Ladoga and the Suvanto waterway, Taipale became a frozen killing field. The Soviets threw wave after wave of men at the Finnish positions. Finnish artillery turned the snow red. The ground was so saturated with blood and shattered by shells that it froze into a crimson, cratered moonscape. The earth became so hard that burial was impossible. The dead weren't laid to rest, they were stacked. The bunkers at Taipale were claustrophobic concrete coffins where Finnish defenders waited in the dark, listening to the whistle of incoming shells, knowing that tons of frozen earth might collapse on them at any moment. The Soviets suffered even worse, advancing across open ground in their thousands, mowed down by Finnish machine guns. Their bodies left where they fell, because retrieving the dead meant exposing yourself to the same fate. Historians will tell you about casualty ratios and strategic importance. They'll explain how the Finns held the line for 105 days, despite being outnumbered 5-1. They'll describe the tactical brilliance, the improvised defenses, the legendary snipers. But the history books don't tell us what the soldiers saw when the flares went out. They don't speak of the sounds that came from no man's land when the artillery fell silent. They don't mention the walls built not of stone or sandbags, but of men, like the one in our first story. Story 1. The wall of the frozen dead Imo Virtanen was 23 years old and had been awake for 67 hours straight. He knew this because he'd been counting the hours, counting the shells, counting the bodies. Counting was the only thing that kept his mind from slipping into the white static of exhaustion. He was a conscript, a farmer's son from Savonia, who'd never fired a rifle in anger until 3 weeks ago. Now he couldn't remember what silence sounded like. The Suvanto waterway defensive line was supposed to be temporary, a hasty earthwork thrown up to buy time for the main fortifications. But the main fortifications had been overrun on the second day, and temporary had become permanent, and permanent had become eternal. There were no sandbags, those had run out in the first week. There was no concrete. That was reserved for the command bunkers to the rear. What they had was frozen earth, determination, and an endless supply of Soviet corpses. The temperature had dropped again overnight. Amo's thermometer, a precious item he'd salvaged from a destroyed field hospital, read -42 Celsius. At that temperature, metal stuck to bare skin, moisture froze in your nostrils. Your rifle bolt could seize up if you didn't keep it wrapped against your chest between shots. And the shelling was constant. Not the massive barrages that had characterized the opening days of the war, but a steady, methodical hammering. Every 15 minutes, like clockwork, Soviet artillery would drop shells along the line. It was psychological warfare, designed to prevent sleep, to erode sanity, to grind them down until they made mistakes. Amo shared a dugout with 7 other men. Korpela, the sergeant, had stopped speaking 2 days ago and now communicated only in grunts and hand signals. Munkinen hummed folk songs under his breath, the same 3 bars over and over until you wanted to shoot him yourself. Laksonen prayed constantly, his whispered litany, blending with the wind. Tonight they had received new orders that made Amo's stomach twist even though he was too exhausted to feel proper horror anymore. "We're building a wall," Korpela said, his voice rough from disuse. He'd gathered the squad in the deepest part of the trench, away from the cutting wind. "Commands orders, defensive barrier, 2 meters high, running the length of our sector." "With what materials, Sergeant?" Munkinen asked, his humming finally silenced. Korpela looked at each of them in turn, his eyes flat and dead as frozen ponds. Then he pointed toward no man's land. The Soviet assault had come at dawn the previous day. A human wave attack, hundreds of men in their brown greatcoats, scrambling across the snow and ice. The Finnish machine guns had cut them down in windows. The artillery had done the rest. By noon, no man's land was carpeted with bodies. By sunset, those bodies had frozen solid. "You can't be serious," Laksonen whispered. "The ground's too hard to dig deeper." Korpela replied, "We don't have sandbags. We don't have timber. We have them." He gestured toward the killing field. "The Soviets will attack again tomorrow or the next day. When they do, I want something between us and their bullets. The dead can serve one last purpose." Imo felt his gorge rise, but he swallowed it down. In the abstract, it made a terrible kind of sense. The frozen bodies would be as effective as sandbags, perhaps more so, given their rigidity at these temperatures. It was practical. It was necessary. It was monstrous. They went out after midnight, when the artillery fell silent for the Red Army's shift change. 8 men with ropes and iron hooks, venturing into no man's land like grave robbers. The moon was a sliver, providing just enough light to see by. The snow crunched under their boots, a sound that would have been pleasant on a winter hike, but now made them wince, certain that every footfall would draw machine, gunfire. The first body Amo approached had been a young man, probably no older than himself. He lay on his back, arms outstretched, mouth open in a final scream. The blood around him had frozen into a pink halo. Hoarfrost glittered in his eyelashes. Amo hooked the rope under the corpse's armpits and pulled. The body didn't budge. It had frozen to the ground, welded in place by its own blood and the moisture in the snow. Amo had to use his entrenching tool to chip away the ice, then lever the corpse up like prying a board from a floor. When it finally came free, it made a sound like tearing canvas. The body was rigid, locked in its death pose. Light, impossibly light. The cold had desiccated it, turned it into something more like wood than flesh. Amo and Mordkainen carried it between them, like a grotesque piece of furniture, back to the trench line. They stacked the first few bodies horizontally, creating a foundation. The corpses fit together with horrible precision, an arm here filling a gap, a torso there creating a solid wall. As they worked, Amo tried not to look at the faces, tried not to notice the expressions, tried not to think about the families who would never know where their sons and brothers had ended up. By dawn, they had built a wall 2 meters high and 20 meters long, a rampart of frozen flesh, anonymous in the pre-dawn darkness. When the sun rose, pale and weak through the perpetual cloud cover, the wall cast a long shadow across the trench. Imo slept for 4 hours, dreamless and deep. When he woke, Laksonen was on watch, staring at the wall with wide, unblinking eyes. "Something wrong?" Amo asked. Accepting a tin cup of ersatz coffee from Munkinen. "They're whispering," Laksonen said. "What? The wall? I can hear them whispering, can't make out the words. But he trailed off, shaking his head. Never mind, I am just tired. Amo listened, wind, distant artillery, the creak of frozen wood, nothing else. He told himself Laksonen was cracking. They were all cracking, just at different rates. But that night he heard it too. He was on watch, 2 in the morning, the darkest part of the night. The wind had died down to nothing, creating an eerie stillness. And in that stillness, he heard it, a susurrus of voices, dozens of them speaking in Russian, low and urgent, like people having a conversation in the next room, coming from the wall. Aimo's hand went to his rifle, but he didn't raise it. What would he shoot? The dead? He strained to hear individual words, but the voices remained just below the threshold of comprehension. A murmur, a whisper, a conspiracy of the dead. He told himself it was the wind finding hollow spaces in the stacked bodies, creating a whistling effect. Or perhaps it was Soviet radio chatter, carried on some strange acoustic phenomenon across the frozen landscape. Anything but what his hindbrain was screaming, that the corpses were talking to each other. The next day, Mordkainen was found dead in his sleeping roll. No wounds, no blood. His face was blue, his expression peaceful. The medic who examined him said it was exposure, hypothermia. But that made no sense. They'd all been in the same dugout, shared the same thin blankets. Why only Mordkainen? They added his body to the wall. Korpela's orders. We need every advantage, he said, and no one had the strength to argue. That night, Amo heard Mordkainen's humming coming from the wall. The same 3 bars over and over. 3 nights later, during a Soviet probing attack, Amo saw it happen. Flares hung in the sky, casting everything in stark white light and deep black shadows. Soviet infantry were advancing in a skirmish line, testing the defenses. Amo was firing his rifle on semi-automatic, the buttstock thudding against his shoulder. Beside him, Korpela manned the machine gun, traversing back and forth. A Soviet grenade arced over the trench and landed 2 meters from Amo. He had perhaps a second to react, not enough time to pick it up and throw it back, barely enough time to throw himself flat. He dove toward the wall, pressing himself against the frozen corpses. The grenade detonated with a flat crack. Shrapnel whined overhead. Amo waited for the pain of a wound that didn't come. Instead, he felt pressure. Hands gripping his shoulders, his arms pulling him tighter against the wall, pulling him down into a gap between bodies that hadn't been there a moment before. In the strobing light of the flares, he looked up into the frozen face of a Soviet soldier. The eyes were open. The eyes were moving. The pupils tracked him, focused on him with terrible awareness. The mouth didn't move, couldn't move, locked in ice. But Amo heard the voice in his head, as clearly as if the man had spoken aloud. So warm. You are so warm. More hands now, all around him. Dozens of them. The corpses in the wall were moving, shifting, pressing against him, not attacking, cradling. Like hypothermia victims trying to share body heat with someone who still had warmth to give. The frozen flesh against his own, drawing the heat from him, drinking it in like a sponge, absorbing water. Stay with us. Stay with us. It is so cold out here. Stay with us and be warm together. Imo tried to scream, but one of the hands covered his mouth. Frost spread across his lips where the frozen flesh touched him. He could feel his own warmth being pulled from his core, siphoned away. The corpses weren't dead, they were trapped, conscious and aware, frozen in the moment of their deaths and desperately, hungrily jealous of his life. The flares went out. Darkness crashed down like a physical weight. The hands released him. Amo scrambled backward, his boots slipping on ice and spent shell casings. The Soviet attack had been repulsed. The night was quiet again, except for the moaning of the wounded. Korpela found him an hour later, still pressed against the back wall of the trench, as far from the corpse wall as he could get. "You all right, Virtanen?" Imo couldn't speak, couldn't explain. "How do you tell your sergeant that the wall you built together is alive? That the dead are jealous? That they want to pull you in with them? Trap you in the ice, make you one of them instead?" He just nodded and accepted the cigarette Corpela offered, even though he didn't smoke. The tobacco tasted like ash and copper, but the act of breathing smoke in and out gave him something to focus on besides the whispering that was starting up again behind him. They found Amo 3 days later, after the Soviet assault that finally broke the line. He was huddled against the corpse wall, not seeking shelter from it, but pressed against it like a lover. His rifle was unfired, his ammunition untouched. He was alive, technically breathing, heart beating. But when they tried to pull him away from the wall, he fought them with savage desperation, screaming in a language that wasn't Finnish or Russian or any human tongue. They dragged him to the rear and sent him to the hospital in Viipuri. The doctors diagnosed him with shell shock, battle fatigue, acute psychotic break. They didn't see what the medics who'd extracted him had seen, the way the bodies in the wall had been arranged around him, sheltering him from shrapnel and bullets. The way the frozen hands had been positioned, not reaching for him, but reaching over him, forming a cage of dead flesh that had kept him alive when everyone else in his squad had died. Amo never left Taipale, not really. Oh, they evacuated his body, sent it home after the war ended. But something essential remained behind, frozen in the wall. For the rest of his life, he would wake in the middle of the night, certain he could hear whispering in Russian. He kept his apartment at 85 degrees, sweating in the winter, desperate for warmth that never quite reached his bones. And on the coldest nights, when the temperature dropped and frost formed on the windows, he would stand at the glass and look out at the darkness, remembering the hands, remembering the eyes, remembering the terrible, hungry coldness of the dead. He died in 1967 in his sleep, in the middle of summer. When they found him, the room was freezing cold, the windows crusted with frost. And though the coroner ruled it a heart attack, the medic who'd pulled him from Taipale all those years ago would have recognized the expression on his face, relief. Amo's mind fractured under the weight of the dead, crushed by the knowledge that the boundaries between the living and the frozen were thinner than the ice on Lake Ladoga. But while the land was a nightmare of improvised fortifications and psychological horror, the water offered no escape. If anything, it offered worse. On the edges of Taipale lies Lake Ladoga, the largest lake in Europe. In the winter of 1939, it became a frozen highway for Soviet armor and a graveyard for thousands. The Finns shelled the ice, artillery craters became open water. Tanks and men plunged through into the black depths below. And the lake, they say, remembers everything that drowns in it. When the ice is clear and the moonlight strong, you can still see them down there, the drowned regiment, marching in formation at the bottom of the lake, forever trying to reach the far shore. Story 2. The Crimson Sheets, Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Volkov of the 7th Tank Brigade, had driven across ice before. As a boy in Siberia, he'd raced sleds across the frozen Yenisei River. During training exercises near Moscow, he'd piloted his T-26 light tank across the Moskva in January, the ice groaning but holding under the 10-ton vehicle. He knew ice, he respected ice, but he'd never been asked to drive across 15 kilometers of it. In the dark, under artillery fire, knowing that hundreds of tons of armor were following behind him, Lake Ladoga stretched before him like a white void, featureless and vast in the pre-dawn darkness. Somewhere on the far shore were the Finnish positions, and somewhere between here and there were the pressure ridges, the thin spots, the places where the ice was only centimeters thick over water, cold enough to stop your heart in seconds. All units maintained 50-meter spacing, the radio crackled. Colonel Grishin's voice, thin with distance. Follow the route markers exactly. Any deviation risks. Static washed out the rest. Nikolai adjusted the dial, but the interference was too strong. Probably Finnish radio jamming. He was on his own. Through the narrow vision slit, he could see the white stakes that marked the safe route. A path across the ice that engineers had supposedly surveyed and deemed passable. Every 100 meters, a stake. Follow the stakes, reach the shore. Outflank the Finnish defensive line, simple. Behind him, in the crew compartment, his driver Dmitri and gunner Pavel waited in tense silence. The T-26 was cramped, cold despite the engine heat, and filled with the smell of diesel and unwashed bodies. They'd been living in this steel coffin for 3 days, sleeping in shifts, eating hard bread and drinking water that froze if you left it in your canteen, Lieutenant. Dmitri's voice over the intercom. The ice is making sounds. Nikolai listened. Yes, beneath the rumble of the engine and the squeak of the treads, there was another sound. A deep, resonant groaning. Like the lake itself was complaining about the weight being placed upon it. Perfectly normal. Ice always made sounds. It was when the sounds stopped that you needed to worry. Keep moving, Nikolai ordered. Maintain speed. 5 kilometers. Per hour. The 26 crawled forward, following the stakes. The ice beneath them was thick, over a meter in most places. The engineers had promised. Enough to support a tank. Enough to support the entire brigade. The first shell landed 300 meters to their left. Nikolai saw the flash, then felt the shock wave rock the tank. Ice gazered up, black water fountaining through the hole. The Finnish coastal guns had found their range. Evasive maneuvers, he shouted, knowing even as he said it how absurd it sounded. You couldn't take evasive maneuvers on ice. The route was the route. Deviation meant death. More shells now, walking across the lake in a line of destruction. The Finns weren't trying to hit the tanks directly. They were hitting the ice. Each impact sent cracks spiderwebbing across the frozen surface. The groaning grew louder. Through the periscope, Nikolai saw the tank ahead of them, Lieutenant Sokolov's vehicle, lurch sideways. The ice beneath it had given way. Not completely, but enough to tilt the tank at a 30-degree angle. The treads spun uselessly, throwing up fountains of slush that looked black in the pre-dawn light. No, not black, red. The water coming up through the ice wasn't the clear, dark water of a deep lake. It was crimson, viscous, more like blood than water. The slush around Sokolov's foundering tank was pink, then red, then a deep arterial scarlet. What the hell? Pavel whispered. Nikolai had heard the stories. 3 days ago, the first wave of the assault had attempted this same crossing. 2 full battalions of infantry marching across the ice in close formation. The Finnish artillery had massacred them. Hundreds of men had fallen through into the freezing water. Their blood had mixed with the lake, seeping down, trapped under the ice like wine in a bottle. But that had been 3 days ago. The blood should have dispersed, diluted, frozen. It shouldn't still be liquid. It shouldn't still be red. The shelling intensified. Nikolai's tank shuddered as a shell landed close enough to throw ice fragments against the armor. The radio was nothing but static now. He'd lost contact with the column, lost sight of the route markers in the chaos of gazering water and smoke. Lieutenant, we need to turn back. Dmitri's voice, high with panic. Maintain course. We're over halfway across. But Nikolai wasn't sure. In the chaos, in the dark, he'd lost his orientation. The far shore should be visible by now, but all he could see was white ice and red water and the black smoke of burning tanks. The engine sputtered, coughed, died. Dmitri, I don't know, sir. Fuel line must be frozen. Impossible. The T-26 was designed for Russian winters. The fuel lines were insulated, the engine compartment heated. But even as Nikolai thought this, he felt the temperature inside the tank dropping. His breath misted in front of his face. Frost formed on the inside of the vision slit. Get it started now. Dmitri worked the starter once, twice. The engine turned over but didn't catch. Outside, Nikolai could hear other sounds now, not just the artillery, but something else, a creaking, grinding sound like ice floes rubbing against each other, and beneath that, something that might have been wind, but sounded unsettlingly like voices. "We're drifting," Pavel said, looking through the gunner's sight. He was right. Without power, without the treads holding them in place, the tank was moving, not sinking. The ice beneath them was still solid, but sliding, pushed by some current or force that Nikolai couldn't identify. They were moving away from the route, away from the column, out into the white void of the frozen lake. The fog was rolling in now, dense and unnatural, rising up through the cracks in the ice like steam from a cauldron. It wrapped around the tank, cutting visibility to mere meters. Nikolai could no longer see the other tanks, could no longer see anything but swirling whiteness tinged with pink. "Pavel, can you see anything through your sight?" "No, sir, just fog. Wait, there is something moving." Nikolai pressed his face to the periscope, straining to see. "Shapes in the fog, figures walking. Infantry," Dmitri asked, hope in his voice. "Maybe our boys caught up." But these figures weren't moving like living men. They moved in perfect unison, a synchronized march that reminded Nikolai of parade, ground drills, and they were moving in the wrong direction, not toward the shore, but parallel to it, following the edge of some boundary Nikolai couldn't see. As they drew closer, details resolved through the fog. They were wearing Soviet uniforms, the brown greatcoats and budanovkas of regular infantry. But their movements were wrong, stiff, mechanical, and they weren't walking on the ice. They were walking through it. Nikolai watched in frozen horror as the figures passed within meters of the tank. He could see them clearly now through the periscope, waterlogged, bloated. Their faces the color of fish bellies, eyes white and staring. Some were missing limbs, others had gaping wounds in their chests and heads. But they all marched in perfect formation, in step, as if still following the orders that had sent them across the ice 3 days ago. "The drowned regiment. Do you see them?" he whispered into the intercom. Silence from his crew. He looked back through the connecting hatch. Dmitri and Pavel were staring at each other, faces white. "We see them, sir," Pavel finally said. The dead soldiers marched past, disappearing into the fog. Nikolai counted them. 50, 100, 200, they just kept coming. An endless column emerging from the ice and vanishing back into it, their boots making no sound, their passage leaving no trace. And then the scratching started. It came from outside, from the hull, a scraping, dragging sound like fingernails on metal. Nikolai's heart hammered against his ribs. Something was trying to get in. "Pavel, load around, high explosive." "Sir, we can't fire without a target." I said, "Load." The scraping grew louder, more insistent. Now it was coming from multiple directions. The turret, the sides, the rear hatch. Nikolai pressed his ear against the cold metal and heard it clearly, fingers. Dozens of them, scratching and clawing at the armor with methodical patience. The fog outside began to glow with a sickly phosphorescence. The moonlight was breaking through, and in its pale illumination, Nikolai saw something that stopped his breath. The ice beneath the tank was becoming transparent. Not melting, it remained solid and thick, but it was turning to glass, becoming clear as window pane. And beneath it, pressed against the underside, like children pressing their faces to a candy shop window, were hundreds of faces. Dead faces, drowned faces, their mouths open in silent screams, their hands reaching up toward the tank. They were trapped under the ice, frozen in the moment of their deaths, preserved in the black water like specimens in formaldehyde, and they were looking up at him with desperate, pleading eyes, looking at his warmth, his life, his beating heart, wanting what he had, needing what he had. The temperature inside the tank continued to drop. Nikolai could see his breath now, great clouds of vapor. The metal walls were rimed with frost. The periscope was icing over from the inside. The heater. Dmitri shouted, "Why isn't the heater working?" But Nikolai knew. The cold wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from below, seeping up through the solid metal floor of the tank, radiating from the mass of frozen dead beneath them. This wasn't weather. This was something else. Pavel was pointing at the floor, his mouth working soundlessly. Nikolai followed his gaze and felt his sanity slip another notch toward the edge. There were wet boot prints on the floor. They led from the solid steel plate of the hull, appearing from nowhere, as if someone had walked through the metal itself. Water dripped from them, pooling on the floor. The water was pink. Nikolai could see his own reflection in it, pale and terrified. The scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, Nikolai heard a new sound, splashing, the sound of someone moving through water. Inside the tank, inside the sealed crew compartment, the temperature dropped below freezing. Frost covered every surface. Nikolai's hands stuck to the metal as he tried to traverse the periscope. He pulled them free, leaving skin behind, blood freezing before it could drip. And then he saw the hands, pale, waterlogged hands with fingers like white worms, reaching up through the solid floor, reaching for Dmitri, reaching for Pavel, reaching for him. They weren't ghosts. They weren't incorporeal. They were solid, real, strong, and they were pulling themselves up through the steel as if it were water, emerging from the metal itself, climbing into the tank. Nikolai opened his mouth to scream, but water poured into his lungs, cold lake water, tasting of blood and copper and death. His vision darkened at the edges. The last thing he saw was the face of a drowned soldier inches from his own mouth open, pleading silently, "Let us in. Let us in where it is warm. We're so cold out here. Let us in." The Finnish patrol found the tank 4 days later. It was half submerged in a pool of refrozen ice, tilted at an angle, the turret hatch sealed from the inside. The ice around it was stained pink for 10 meters in every direction. Though no shells had hit anywhere near the vehicle, the engine was cold, the batteries dead, the radio silent. Captain Virtanen, no relation to Amo, though he'd heard the stories, approached the tank cautiously. The Soviets had withdrawn from this sector, retreating after the collapse of their offensive. This T-26 had been abandoned by its own side, left behind in the chaos. "Should we salvage it, sir?" his corporal asked. Virtanen examined the hatch. It was dog-tight from the inside, frozen solid. Ice had formed around the seal, creating a perfect hermetic barrier. He could see frost on the periscope lens. The whole tank radiated cold, even in the weak winter sunlight. "Get the tools, we'll open it up. See if there is anything useful inside." It took 20 minutes with crowbars and hammers to break the ice seal and force the hatch open. Virtanen climbed onto the turret, torch in hand, and shone the light down into the crew compartment empty. No bodies, no equipment, no personal effects. Just a thin film of water on the floor, frozen now into a perfectly smooth sheet. And in that ice, Virtanen could see something that made him order his men to reseal the hatch immediately. Boot prints, dozens of them, all pointing downward, leading into the solid metal floor of the tank, as if the crew had walked down into the steel itself, down into the ice, down into the black water, and the drowned regiment that marched there forever. They left the tank where it lay. 50 years later, when the ice finally melted enough to sink it, divers would find it on the bottom of the lake. The hatch was still sealed. The crew compartment was still empty, but the metal floor of the tank had deep gouges in it, scratch marks, as if someone had clawed at it from underneath for a very, very long time. The lake claimed the bodies, pulling them down into the depths where the drowned march in endless formation. But the forests of Taipale claimed something else, something less tangible, but perhaps more precious. The forests claimed the souls. As the war dragged on, As the casualties mounted into the tens of thousands, the landscape itself began to change. The trees, shattered by artillery, stood like skeletal fingers pointing at the sky. The snow was no longer white but gray with ash and pink with blood. And the air itself felt wrong, thick with something that wasn't quite fog and wasn't quite smoke. The living began to feel like intruders in a world that belonged to the dead. And in the forests, where the snipers waited in their white camouflage, something else waited too. Something that wore the face of winter itself and demanded payment for every soul that survived its killing fields. Story 3. The White Death's shadow Elias Meinkel had killed 147 men. He knew the exact number because he carved a mark into the stock of his rifle for each confirmed kill. Not out of pride. Pride was a luxury for men who fought in daylight. Elias fought in the gray spaces, the dawn mist, the twilight shadow. He fought alone, far from his unit, deep in the devastated forests of Taipale, where the border between the world of the living and the world of the dead grew thinner with each passing day. Before the war, he'd been a hunter. Elk mostly, sometimes bear. He'd learned patience in the deep forests of Kainu, learned to read the land, to move without sound, to become part of the landscape. The army had given him a purpose for those skills and a Mosin Nagant M28 .30 rifle to exercise them. Now he was something else. The Soviets called snipers like him kulaks, the White Death. They weren't wrong. It was the 73rd day of the war. The forest around Taipale had been beautiful once. Tall pines, thick undergrowth, pristine snow. Now it looked like something from a fever dream. Soviet artillery had stripped the branches from the trees, leaving trunks that looked like the grasping fingers of buried giants. Shell craters pocked the landscape, some filled with frozen blood, others with the tangled remains of men and equipment. The snow wasn't white anymore. It was gray with ash, pink with blood, black with the char of napalm. This was the hell of Taipale, and Elias was its grim reaper. He lay in his hide, a shallow scrape in the snow beneath a fallen log, covered with a white canvas sheet and dusted with fresh powder. His position overlooked a Soviet supply route, a narrow track through the devastation where trucks and men moved with increasing caution. They knew he was out here somewhere. They knew that the forest had eyes, and those eyes belonged to the White Death. Elias had been in position for 19 hours. His body was stiff with cold, despite the layers of wool and fur. His bladder was full, but he wouldn't move to relieve himself. Movement meant death, either from Soviet counter-snipers or from his own body's betrayal, when muscles locked from the cold failed to respond when he needed them most. Through his scope, he watched a Soviet platoon forming up on the track. They were preparing for something, a patrol, maybe, or another assault on the Finnish positions. Their lieutenant was speaking to them, giving orders. His breath misting in the cold air, Elias settled the crosshairs on the lieutenant's chest. Range 380 meters. Wind, negligible temperature correction, accounted for. He let out half a breath, found the space between heartbeats, and the lieutenant moved wrong. Not flinched, not dodged. Moved wrong. His gestures became mechanical. His movements synchronized with the men around him in a way that was too perfect, too rhythmic, like puppets on strings, like men who weren't thinking about what they were doing, but simply going through motions programmed into them. Elias had seen shell shock before, had seen men reduced to automatons by the horror of war, but this was different. These men moved with purpose, with direction, but without awareness. Their eyes were open, but nothing looked out from them. He shifted his aim to a private standing at parade rest. Through the scope's magnification, Elias could see the man's face clearly. The skin was waxy, the color wrong, too pale, with a grayish undertone. The eyes were wide and staring, the pupils dilated despite the bright morning light. Elias took the shot anyway. The rifle kicked. The report echoed across the forest, 400 meters away. The private jerked as the 7.62 millimeters round punched through his sternum. He fell backward into the snow and then stood back up. Elias worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, chambering a fresh round. Through the scope, he watched the private regain his feet. There was a hole in his chest. Elias could see it, could see the dark stain spreading across the brown uniform. But the man didn't clutch at the wound, didn't scream, didn't fall again. He simply rejoined the formation, taking his place in the ranks as if nothing had happened. The platoon began to march, not toward the finish lines, as Elias expected, but perpendicular to them, following the tree line in a precise measured pace that reminded him of a funeral procession. Elias fired again, headshot this time on the lieutenant. The man's head snapped back, a spray of blood and bone visible even at this distance. He fell and stood back up. The hole in his skull was clearly visible through the scope, a crater where the back of his head had been, but he rejoined the march, keeping perfect step with his men. His ruined head still turning to survey the forest with eyes that should have been dead. This was wrong. This was beyond wrong. Elias had killed 147 men, and he knew what happened when you shot a man. They fell, they bled, they died. They didn't stand up and keep marching. He rolled out of his hide, breaking his own protocols, abandoning the patient hunter's stillness for panicked flight. Something was very wrong here, and every instinct he'd honed over years in the forest was screaming at him to run. But the forest had changed while he'd been in position. The trees that had been skeletal ruins an hour ago now seemed to have multiplied, grown denser. The shadows between them were too deep, too dark for the weak winter sun to penetrate, and the snow was moving, swirling in patterns that had nothing to do with wind. Elias shouldered his rifle and began to move through the forest, heading back toward finish lines. He knew this ground. He'd mapped every meter of it in his head. 3 kilometers due west would bring him to the defensive positions at Sector 7. But after walking for 15 minutes, he found himself in the same clearing he'd started from. His own tracks in the snow, the disturbed earth of his hide, the spent shell casings glinting in the thin light. Impossible. He hadn't circled back. He'd maintained a straight bearing, used the sun as a reference. Yet here he was, exactly where he'd started. He tried again, this time marking his trail, breaking branches to create waypoints. 15 minutes, same clearing, same tracks. The broken branches he'd created weren't there, or rather, they were there, but they'd been broken before, weeks ago. The breaks weathered and old. Elias was trapped in a loop, a geographic impossibility, a fold in space that brought him back to his starting point, no matter which direction he traveled. He wasn't alone, though. The Soviet platoon was still marching. He could see them through the trees, moving in their perfect mechanical formation. They were following the perimeter of something, walking the boundary of an invisible circle that encompassed the clearing. Elias counted them, 43 men. He watched them complete their circuit, 3 minutes, 17 seconds. Then they started again, following the exact same path, their boots landing in the exact same prints they'd made moments before. A loop within a loop, a recording playing on endless repeat. Through his scope, Elias examined the soldiers more carefully. Now that he was watching for it, he could see the wrongness in all of them. The lieutenant with the ruined skull, the private with the chest wound. But there were others too, men missing arms, men with gaping wounds in their bellies, men whose heads lolled at angles that spoke of broken necks. These men had been dead for weeks. Elias recognized some of them from previous engagements. That sergeant had fallen to a Finnish machine gun nest on day 12. That corporal had been killed by a mine on day 36. The lieutenant had died. Elias was certain in an artillery barrage 2 weeks ago. He was watching a massacre play out on repeat. A spiritual echo of a battle trapped in the landscape, like a photograph burned into wood. The forest groaned around him, not the sound of wind in branches. This was deeper, more fundamental. The sound of the earth itself protesting the weight of death it had absorbed. The hell of Taipale had become more than a nickname. It had become a reality. Elias loaded a fresh magazine, his hands shaking. He had 16 rounds left. Useless against an enemy that wouldn't die, but the weight of the rifle was comforting even if its purpose had become meaningless. The shadows between the trees were moving now, coalescing, taking shape. Something was coming, something big, something that moved against the grain of reality, pushing through the membrane between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. Elias saw it emerge from between two shattered pines. At first, he thought it was a soldier. It had the rough shape of a man, tall and broad, shouldered. But as it moved into the clearing, details resolved that made Elias's rational mind rebel. It was wearing white, not a uniform, a cowl, a cloak of pure white that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Where the Soviet soldiers were gray and dead, this figure was pristine, untouched by the gore and mud of war. But beneath the cowl, where a face should have been, there was only darkness, not shadow, absence, a void in the shape of a head, the White Death. Not the nickname the Soviets used for snipers, the real thing. Winter itself, given form and purpose. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, and the Soviet platoon stopped marching. They turned as one to face Elias, their dead eyes fixing on him with sudden, terrible awareness. The figure in white raised one arm skeletal thin beneath the cowl and pointed at Elias. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of ice cracking on a frozen lake, the whisper of snow sliding from a pine bough, the hiss of wind across a barren field. Elias raised his rifle, knowing even as he did that bullets would be meaningless here. "You have taken much from my fields," the White Death said. 147 souls sent into my embrace. I have allowed this. War feeds me, nourishes me, gives me strength. But there is a price for survival in my domain. The Soviet soldiers began to advance, not running but walking with that same mechanical precision. Elias fired. The nearest one's head exploded. The body kept walking. He fired again, emptying his magazine into the approaching dead, each shot finding its mark, each shot meaningless. "The price," the White Death continued, "is what you took from them: life, warmth, the privilege of breath. You wish to leave my forest alive? Then you must pay the toll." Elias dropped his rifle and ran. He crashed through the undergrowth, his earlier stealth abandoned for desperate speed behind him. He could hear the measured tread of the dead platoon, keeping pace with him effortlessly. And above it all, that voice like breaking ice: "Run, hunter. Run and know that every step you take in my forest is borrowed. Every breath you draw is a debt that will be collected." They found Elias at the finished defensive line 3 hours later. He walked out of the forest alone, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his face expressionless. The guards challenged him, but he didn't respond. He simply walked past them into the command bunker and collapsed against the far wall. When they examined his rifle, they found the barrel bent at a 45-degree angle, as if it had been grabbed by something impossibly strong and twisted. The wood of the stock was split down the grain, ruined beyond repair. His ammunition pouches were full, not with bullets, with snow, packed tight, the individual flakes perfectly preserved, as if they'd been frozen in place. Elias spoke only once, when the battalion commander asked him what had happened. "I shot them," he whispered. "I shot them all, hundreds, thousands. I couldn't stop shooting. Everyone fell, and everyone stood back up. The forest is full of them, walking, marching, waiting." They sent him to the rear. Diagnosed with combat fatigue, but the medics noticed something strange. Despite having spent hours in the forest in sub-zero temperatures, Elias showed no signs of frostbite. His fingers were pink and warm, his toes unblemished. It was as if the cold had passed through him without touching him, as if he'd been marked by it, but not claimed. Not yet. Elias Munkel survived the Winter War. He survived the Continuation War. He lived to see Finland's independence preserved, to see his country rebuilt from the ashes of conflict. But he never hunted again, never picked up a rifle, never ventured into the deep forests of Kainuu. When asked why, he would only say, "I met something in the forest, something that owns the winter. It let me go, but it kept something of mine. And someday, when the debt comes due, it will call in what I owe." He died in his sleep in 1987, an old man in a warm bed. But the nurses who found him noted something strange. His body was cold, colder than it should have been, even accounting for the hours since death. And on his lips, frozen there like rime on a window, was a thin film of frost. His pockets were full of snow, fresh snow. In the middle of August, Elias put down his rifle and walked away from the war, hoping distance and time would erase what he'd seen in the forests of Taipale. He spent 47 years trying to forget, trying to convince himself it had been exhaustion, hallucination, the mind's desperate attempt to make sense of the senseless. But the thing about trauma, real trauma, the kind that stains the land and soaks into the earth like blood into snow, is that it doesn't fade, it waits, it endures. Decades later, when the guns are silent and the bunkers are buried under peat and grass, when the forests have regrown and the lake waters run clear, when the surviving soldiers are old men with medals gathering dust in drawers, even then the ground remembers. Our final story brings us to the present day, to archaeologists with their careful brushes and grid systems, their scientific methodology and academic detachment, to people who believe that the past is safely past, that the dead are safely dead, and that horror is something that only happens in history books. They are wrong. Story 4. Excavation at Sector 4. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had excavated 18 World War II sites across Europe, but nothing had prepared her for Taipale. She stood at the edge of the dig site, a cleared patch of forest in eastern Finland, watching her team set up their equipment. Ground-penetrating radar, GPS markers, photography drones, all the tools of modern archaeology, arrayed against a past that was only 85 years old, but felt infinitely more distant. The Finnish Heritage Board had brought her in as a consultant. They were preparing the battlefield for museum interpretation, recovering artifacts for display, documenting the positions for historical research. Clean work, academic work, the kind of project that resulted in journal articles and exhibition catalogs, not nightmares. But the locals weren't happy about it. "You shouldn't dig there," the old man had said. His name was Virtanen. There were a lot of Virtanens in this region, and he'd been a boy during the war. That bunker was sealed for a reason. Sarah had smiled politely, the way she'd learned to smile at local superstitions. Every site had them. The French villagers who wouldn't let her excavate a certain field near Verdun because they claimed they could still hear the screams. The Polish farmer who insisted that the forest near his land was wrong and refused to guide her team through it. Folklore trauma, the human mind's way of processing horror. "I appreciate your concern," she'd told him, "but we have ground-penetrating radar, engineering surveys, safety equipment. Whatever's down there, we can handle it." The old man had shaken his head. The signs don't say danger. In Finnish, they say El Hurtun. He paused. Do not wake. Now. Standing at the edge of the excavation, Sarah felt the first whisper of unease. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects. Just the sound of her team's tools and the gentle sigh of wind through the pines. The bunker entrance had been buried under 2 meters of peat and soil, overgrown with roots and moss. It had taken them 3 days to locate it using the old military maps. another 2 to expose it. Now it lay before them, a concrete threshold descending into darkness, marked with faded Finnish military insignia and those signs the old man had mentioned. Do not wake. Sarah photographed the signs, cataloged them, then ordered them removed. They were artifacts now, destined for museum storage. The bunker itself was the real prize. An intact Finnish defensive position, potentially containing weapons, personal effects, documents. A time capsule from the Winter War. It was also, though Sarah didn't know this yet, a tomb. They broke the seal at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in June. The concrete plug that had been poured across the bunker entrance came away in chunks, revealing a stairway descending into absolute darkness. Sarah shone her flashlight down the steps. The beam seemed to be absorbed by the shadows rather than penetrating them. Temperature reading, she asked. Her assistant Miko checked the thermometer. 4 degrees Celsius. Odd, it is 22 degrees up here. Sarah made a note on her tablet. Underground bunkers often maintain different temperatures, but this was unusually cold. Air quality, stale but breathable, all levels normal, no methane, no toxins. Good, let's go in. The stairs were steep and narrow, clearly designed for soldiers in a hurry rather than archaeological comfort. Sarah descended carefully, her headlamp cutting a cone of light through the darkness. Behind her, Miko followed with the camera equipment, documenting every step. 23 stairs, Sarah counted them. At the bottom, a corridor stretched away into darkness, concrete walls slick with moisture. The air smelled of earth and metal and something else. Something organic that made her think of old freezers of preserved meat. The first room was a sleeping quarters. 4 bunks, wooden and rotted with age, rusted helmets on pegs. A table with the remains of a meal, plates, cups all empty, all covered in a fine layer of dust that swirled in their lamplight. No bodies, Miko observed. Sarah nodded, cataloging the artifacts with her camera. It wasn't unusual for bunkers to be evacuated before sealing. The soldiers would have pulled out, taking their dead with them before the engineers closed it up. Still, something felt wrong. The room looked lived in like the occupants had just stepped out. The second room was a communication center. Radio equipment, maps still pinned to the walls, code books in a pile. Sarah approached the maps, studying them. They showed the Finnish defensive positions around Taipale, dated December 1939, but someone had drawn on them. Additions in red pencil sketched over the original military markings, not tactical symbols. These were crude, disturbed, circles, spirals, and in the margins, handwritten notes in Finnish that Sarah would later learn translated to, "They're in the walls, they're in the ice, they won't stop coming, Sarah." Miko's voice was tight. "You should see this." He was standing at the far end of the corridor, pointing his light into a third room. Sarah joined him and felt her breath catch. It was an ammunition storage room. Crates of shells, rifles stacked against the walls, boxes of grenades, all pristine, untouched by the decades. And in the center of the room, sitting at a makeshift desk, were 2 bodies. One Finnish officer, one Soviet commissar. They sat facing each other across the desk, their hands clasped together as if they'd died shaking hands or praying together. Their uniforms were intact, their flesh preserved by the cold and the sealed environment. But they weren't facing each other. They were both turned toward the door, toward Sarah and Miko, as if they died watching the entrance, waiting for something to come through it. "What the hell?" Miko whispered. Sarah approached slowly, her scientific training warring with a primal instinct that told her to run. The bodies' positions were all wrong. The Finnish officer's neck was twisted at an impossible angle, as if he'd tried to look over his shoulder while keeping his hands locked with the Soviet commissar. The Soviet's face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. On the desk between them was a journal, leather-bound, water-stained. Sarah picked it up with gloved hands and opened it carefully. The entries were in Finnish, written in multiple hands. The first entries were standard military logs, ammunition counts, troop movements, weather reports. But as she flipped through the pages, the handwriting became increasingly erratic. The 6th of December, the shelling has stopped, but we can still hear it inside the walls, inside our heads. The 9th of December, found Munkinen outside. He'd been dead for 3 days, but he was standing upright, frozen solid. We brought him inside to thaw. That was a mistake. The 11th of December, the Soviets in Sector 3 are experiencing the same thing. Their commissar radioed us. He says they've sealed themselves in their bunker. He says something is walking between the positions, and it isn't human. The 13th of December, we met with the commissar, neutral ground. He is as terrified as we are. He says in Russia they have stories about this. The land itself rejecting the dead, refusing to let them rest. He says the only way to contain it is to seal the source. The 15th of December, we're sealing the bunker. Both sides working together. If anyone finds this, do not open the door in the back room. We've trapped it, but the seal is only as strong as the concrete. If you break the seal, you release. The entry ended mid-sentence. Sarah looked up from the journal. There is another room. They found the door behind a stack of crates. It was steel, not concrete, and it had been welded shut. Chains had been wrapped around it, then frozen in place. The metal was covered in scratches, deep gouges, as if something with incredible strength had clawed at it from the other side. Over the door, someone had painted a message in Finnish and Russian. El ava sawen thawen. Do not open, we should leave, Mikko said. Sarah, we should leave right now. But Sarah was already reaching for her tools. Archaeological curiosity warred with common sense and won. She needed to know, needed to see. That was the curse of her profession. The inability to leave mysteries unsolved. It took 40 minutes to cut through the chains, another 20 to grind through the welds. The steel door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through the bunker and beyond, as if the earth itself was protesting. The room beyond was small, barely 3 meters square, empty, completely empty, except for the walls. The walls were covered in scratches, thousands of them, overlapping, creating a pattern that hurt to look at. Sarah shone her light across them and realized with growing horror that they weren't random. They were words carved into the concrete by fingernails and improvised tools. The same phrase over and over, in Finnish and Russian and German and languages Sarah didn't recognize. We are cold, we are cold. We are cold, we are cold. Her equipment died, not gradually, all at once. Her headlamp went dark. Mikko's flashlight extinguished. The camera stopped recording. Even her watch stopped ticking. In the absolute darkness, Sarah heard her own breath, her own heartbeat, and then footsteps coming from behind her, from the corridor they'd just walked down, but not human footsteps. These were wet, dragging, accompanied by a sound like ice cracking. Sarah fumbled for her backup light. Fingers numb with sudden cold, the temperature had dropped. She could see her breath now, even in the darkness. Frost was forming on the walls, on her jacket, on Mikko's face where he stood frozen beside her. The backup light came on. Its beam was weak, battery already dying, but it was enough to see. The corridor was full of soldiers, Finnish, Soviet, standing shoulder to shoulder, filling the space from floor to ceiling, pressed together in impossible density. Their uniforms were rotted, their flesh gray, their eyes white and staring, and they were all facing toward the room Sarah had opened. No, not facing, fleeing. They were pressed against the far wall of the corridor, as far from the back room as they could get, their faces twisted in terror. They weren't attacking, they were hiding from something behind Sarah. She turned slowly, knowing what she would see but unable to stop herself. The scratched room wasn't empty anymore. The shadows had detached from the walls and taken shape. Humanoid, but wrong. Too thin, too tall. Limbs at angles that defied anatomy. And at their center, towering over them all, was something that wore the shape of winter itself. White and void and endless cold. It had been sealed here since 1939, trapped by men so desperate that enemies had worked together to contain it. And Sarah, with her academic curiosity, and her modern tools and her absolute certainty that the past was safely past, had let it out. The thing in the room turned toward her. Where its face should have been, there was only an absence, not darkness, but a hole in reality, a void that pulled at her, that wanted to draw her in and fill her with cold, and make her part of the frozen legion that marched forever in the forests of Taipale. Sarah ran. She doesn't remember the details of the escape. Her mind has mercifully edited them out, leaving only fragments. Miko screaming, the corridor tilting and stretching like taffy, the stairs multiplying, or maybe collapsing. She couldn't tell which. The forest above shifting between summer green and winter white, the landscape flickering between present day and 1939, the soldiers, dead soldiers, frozen soldiers, reaching for her as she ran past, not to stop her, but to plead with her. Don't leave us here, don't leave us in the cold, and behind it all, that presence, that winter thing, following her not with speed but with inevitability, like the changing of seasons, like the falling of snow. She emerged from the bunker into sunlight and stumbled. The excavation team caught her, wrapped her in blankets, called for medical help. She was hypothermic, despite the summer heat, her core temperature dangerously low. Miko didn't come out. They searched the bunker, every room, every corridor. They found the journals, the bodies of the Finnish officer and Soviet commissar still clasped together. They found Sarah's equipment, drained of all power. They found her footprints in the dust, and Miko's beside them. But they didn't find Miko, and they didn't find the back room that Sarah described. The corridor ended at the ammunition storage. There was no steel door, no welded chains, no scratched walls screaming about cold. Sarah told them what she'd seen. They nodded sympathetically and diagnosed her with a severe panic attack, possibly triggered by carbon monoxide poisoning from the sealed bunker. They sealed it back up, this time with sensors and warnings and a proper concrete plug. She returned to the United States the following week. That was 6 months ago. Sarah sits in her apartment in Boston now, in the middle of January, with the thermostat set to 85 degrees. She wears 3 layers of clothing. She sleeps under 4 blankets, and still she is cold. In the bathroom mirror, she notices something new each day. Her shadow is wrong, not displaced, absent. In certain lights, she casts no shadow at all, as if the darkness refuses to acknowledge her existence. And at night, when the temperature drops below freezing outside, she hears it, the sound of boots marching in formation, the whisper of dead men walking, the creak of ice on a frozen lake coming from beneath her floorboards, from behind her walls, from the space between seconds. She realizes now what she has done. The bunker wasn't a tomb, it was a prison, and by opening it, by breaking the seal, she didn't release the trapped horror into the Finnish forest. She brought it home with her. It is patient. It is in no hurry. But every night, the frost creeps a little further up the corners of her apartment. Every morning, her reflection looks a little paler, a little more like the frozen dead she saw in that corridor. Her breath mists even when the heater is running. Ice forms in her coffee. The winter is seeping into her life, claiming what she stole when she walked out of that bunker, while Miko didn't. She can feel it in her bones, that terrible cold. The same cold that turned the forests of Taipale into a frozen hell 85 years ago. And some nights, when she is almost asleep, she feels hands on her shoulders, cold hands, desperate hands, and hears a voice like breaking ice whisper in her ear, "Come back. Come back to the cold. We're waiting for you. We're so cold and you are so warm. Come back and stay with us forever. Sarah knows with absolute certainty that someday soon she'll wake up and find herself back in that bunker. Not physically, she'll still be in her Boston apartment. But part of her, the part that casts shadows and holds warmth, will be gone, taken frozen forever in the hell of Taipale. The land remembers, the cold remembers. And what was sealed in 1939 is patient enough to wait for every debt to be collected. The Battle of Taipale lasted 105 days. The casualties were staggering, tens of thousands dead on both sides, frozen into the landscape, becoming part of the terrain itself. The Finns held the line against impossible odds. The Soviets eventually withdrew, unable to break through. In the strategic sense, it was a Finnish victory. But victory is a strange word for a place where the boundaries between life and death became so blurred that soldiers couldn't tell if they were fighting the living or the dead. Where the cold wasn't just a weather condition, but a force with intention and hunger. Where the land itself became so saturated with violence and suffering that it couldn't absorb any more, and the trauma began to leak back out. The ice has melted now. The bunkers have collapsed or been sealed. The forests have regrown. Taipale is green and quiet in the summer, white and peaceful in the winter. Tourists visit the memorial sites, read the plaques, take photos. Historians study the tactical decisions and strategic importance. But the energy of that slaughter remains, not in documents or monuments, but in the land itself. The locals know. They avoid certain areas of the forest. They don't ice, fish on certain parts of the lake. They tell their children not to play near the old bunker sites, because some places remember, some places hold onto their dead, and some places, once they've tasted that much blood and cold and terror, never quite let go. The soldiers who survived Taipale carried the memories until they died. And maybe, if the stories are true, if Sarah Mitchell's experience means anything, maybe they carry them still, marching in formation beneath the ice, whispering from walls of frozen flesh, waiting in sealed bunkers for someone foolish enough to break the seal and let the winter out. If you felt a chill down your spine that wasn't from the air conditioning, if you found yourself pulling your blanket tighter, if you checked over your shoulder to make sure nothing was standing in the shadows, good, that is appropriate. That means you understand that horror isn't something that only happened in the past. It is something that lingers, that persists, that waits. Make sure to hit that like button. It keeps the fires burning here at the channel. And trust me, we need all the warmth we can get after tonight's episode. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't get left out in the cold for our next story. And tell me in the comments, do you believe extreme trauma can stain the land forever? Can places absorb the horror of what happened there and give it back to the living? Have you ever felt it? That sense of wrongness in a place where terrible things occurred. I want to hear your stories, but maybe wait until daylight to write them. Maybe turn on an extra light. Maybe check the temperature in your room just to make sure it is not dropping without reason. Until next time, stay warm, friends. Stay safe. And if you ever find yourself in Finland, visiting the old battlefields, and you come across a bunker with signs that say, her, do not wake, take the advice. Some sleepers should never be disturbed. Some prisons should never be opened. And some debts once incurred can never be paid in full. Good night. And remember, winter is always coming. The only question is whether you'll be warm enough when it arrives.